How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boil Hobby Time. This week I did something out of the ordinary. After cleaning off my hobby mat, I broke out a box of farm animals. E-I-E-I-O. Inside the box I found a pink horse, a pink pig, and 3 pink dogs. On the other runner there was a cow and 2 empty spots that used to have sheep, which I used on a previous project. The cow is all I needed for this week's project, so I just removed that. Before getting too far into this build, I'd like to stop and say thank you to this week's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives with a wide depth and breadth of creative topics. There are thousands of creative classes in countless categories ranging from beginner to advanced. Categories include illustration, design, animation, film, photography, entrepreneurship, and more. The platform was designed by creatives for creatives. Along with my new studio that I'm working on, which has yet to be built, I'm also doing some updating to the kitchen and bathroom at the house. Skillshare has some awesome, insightful classes for both of those things. Otherwise, their creativity, productivity, and DIY categories are where I gravitate toward. The classes are taught by industry experts and have a learn-by-doing approach. Members can also create and share projects after completing them, which is a cool feature. They also offer on-demand platform and stackable lessons so members can learn at their own pace, which is very helpful for someone like me. The first 500 people to click my link or scan this QR code will receive 1 month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today. Once all of the pieces were free, I started cleaning up the flashing and leftover sprue marks and began gluing this little bovine friend together. Tamiya kits are always a blast to put together and have very nice fits, and while I was assembling this, it made me think of a joke. What happened when the dairy cow jumped over the barbed wire fence? Udder Destruction. Not to worry, I'll never tell a joke like that on this channel again, but after the cow was done, it was time to get the rest of the diorama sorted. The cow is not going to be alone here. I grabbed a handful of cows at 1/72 scale, which is the actual scale of this diorama. As you can see, this is one big cow. One very big cow. I found that most 1/72 scale IMAX minis have some leftover demolding liquid on them, which you can clean off with warm soapy water. Even so, I've also found it best to give them a coat of matte varnish at the end to keep the paint safe. After the minis had had their bath, they were ready to be placed on some painting handles. I glued them all in a line, in no particular order, which I rearranged. I painted the big cow on her own painting handle, and we'll catch up with those later, but for now it's time to work on the farm. The idea was to make a barnyard, and we'll know that it's a barnyard because there will be a yard with a barn on it, which I'm going to make now. I grabbed some pink XPS foam, which was gifted to me by my friend Colton, who recently converted a van into a camper van, and had some leftover insulation foam for me. I sliced up a few layers of foam and began shaping those into the corner of the barn. I decided to just have the corner of the barn rather than the whole front or one side, because dioramas at odd angles tend to look a little bit more interesting than dioramas that are at perfect 90 degrees with perfect framing. Because of that, the angles were a little bit more difficult to figure out how to cut, but I brushed off my high school geometry skills and I eyeballed it. Once I had something that looked like the shape of the corner of a barn, I set that down on the base, which now had a thin slice of foam on top that needed some texture. I protected the spot where the barn will go using some masking tape, and then I gave some variation to the rest of the barnyard using a butane torch. With the basic shape of the diorama figured out, I could start skinning the foam with wood. I had a leftover piece of dollhouse wall paneling from a previous project, which was the perfect size and shape for the front of the barn. After cutting that out and gluing it in place, I moved around to the side. I found some strips of wood that were the same size as the paneling on the front, and then I glued those in place and snapped them with my nippers as I went. After the walls had been boarded up, I began adding the details and trim pieces that will add all the visual interest and make this thing more fun to paint. I used some corrugated O2O styrene for the roof and basswood strips for most of the rest of the details. I went into this build without a concrete plan, which allowed me to make some fun decisions on the fly. But it is important to have at least some idea where you're going so that you can have the proper references available. Like in this case, I did want it to look like a barn, and it would have been very easy to stray from barn if I wasn't careful. And I wasn't careful. I added these two details out of basswood because I thought they looked good, but I had to go back and remove them to be able to accommodate the sliding barn door that makes this thing actually look like a barn. The wood was all sanded pretty smooth, so in order to bring out some of that grain, I went back in with a nice sharp dental tool. The last element I added to the barn were some probably unnecessary strips of wood that I added to the roof, and after that, it was time to make the fence. At this point, I began second-guessing the layout of the diorama. I hadn't glued the barn down, so I experimented with a few other things, but proceeded with the original idea I had, which was to have the fence at the front of the yard. Immediately after gluing it in place, I ripped it out and moved it to the back of the diorama, which I like a lot better. I feel like this creates more of a backdrop rather than splitting the attention of the eyes. With the wooden details done, I cut up some small strips of styrene and I added some door hinges and brackets to the barn doors. With that done, the barn was ready to be glued in place. And then I added what I thought were the final details before painting, which were a 1/72 scale watering can and an axe in a stump. They're not huge details, but I felt like they were just enough to imply that the area is actually used by the farmer. When those had been glued in place, I textured the ground with some mud effects from Vallejo. This will help protect the foam from the later painting steps and also give some nice realistic texture to the ground. And I don't know if the giant cow is enough to suggest that this is a part of the Wild Imaginary West, so I went back and I added a forestall antenna, which in this case is just a repurposed piece of terrain from Star Wars Legion. With the antenna in place, the construction was done and it was ready for some paint, but I had to wait for the mud to dry. Came back the next day and I took it outside and I gave it a coat of gray primer. And I know everybody says it while kit bashing, but that gray priming stage is super satisfying. If you've never done it, you should give it a try. As for the cows and the farmer, they got a coat of black primer from the Airbrush. So far in the Wild Imaginary West, I haven't really said much about unusual livestock or domesticated animals. And I realized that including a 15-foot tall cow in this diorama has implications that may need explanation. But I'm not going to do that in this video. Instead, just assume that some large domesticated animals do exist in one form or another. And I will try and give some proper explanation at some point in the future. As for the story of this diorama, the farmer's name is Jim Angleton. He came out west as a young man with his parents and 4 siblings. They were on their way to settle near what would become known as Tulsa, Oklahoma. Jim's father had come into the possession of a rudimentary forestall in St. Louis, where he had been working for a time to build up the necessary tools and supplies for the rough trip out west. There were many families, like the Angletons in St. Louis, who had crossed the Mississippi and were excited and eager to make a new life for themselves in the West. Unfortunately, most were not ready for what awaited them. Fortunately for Jim and his family, they were able to make it to their homesteading spot with very few setbacks. Granted, it wasn't a trip all the way to Baja or to the Rockies, much less, but Mr. Angleton's hard work and preparation had paid off. From the get-go, Jim had learned how to tune and calibrate a forestall to keep away the fierce predators of the plains, helping his father tremendously in their early years on the homestead. It had been about 30 years since their trip out west, and Jim was now the owner of the family farm. A few of his siblings had continued west, but Jim felt a deep sense of ownership and commitment to keeping what his father had started alive. After all of the base coats had been applied using the airbrush, I switched over to my brush and began painting in the details. I wasn't too concerned about getting perfect transitions or perfect coloring with the brush. I was able to go back and fix that with the airbrush, and I am really happy with how this cow turned out. After the big old cow was done, I switched over to the small old cows, adding the little white patterning on their backs and faces as well. Then I snapped them off the painting handle to make it easier to paint Farmer Jim. At this point, Farmer Jim had the same base colors as his cows, So in order to get him to stand out a little bit better, I gave him a red handkerchief, nice green belt, and a warm brown hat. After the shovel, the paint job on the farmer was done, and it was time to move on to the details on the barn. This project may be a little bit simpler and more silly than some of my other projects, but I had a lot of fun with it. I really enjoyed the painting process, trying to unify the diorama with the miniatures, and this was one of the more fun projects that I've put together in a very long time. It's also one that elicited more of an emotional response from my 1.5-year-old than most of my other projects. He loves cows. The last step in the painting process was to paint the sides of the diorama with black 4.0. And the last step was to glue all the miniatures into position. With Farmer Jim glued in place, the diorama was done. After that, I called it good. Before moving on to my final shots, please take a moment to appreciate the submissions sent in by my patrons for the monthly art challenge, the theme of which was farms. Thanks again to all the patrons who participated last month. And that is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.